All right, Landon, this first question, I kind of want to go, it's almost like a twofer here, right? Because there's two key people on the Cowboys roster in the organization that people basically look at as lame ducks. And I want to get your opinion if you think that's factual or if you think it's being overblown. There's the lame duck, quote unquote, head coach, Mike McCarthy. And there's the somewhat of a lame duck quarterback in Dak Prescott. A lot of people think this is each of their last seasons with the Cowboys. What are your thoughts on that storyline this offseason?
I mean, it's the storyline of the offseason, definitely, for the Cowboys, and frankly, for a lot of the league, it seems like everyone's kind of wondering what's going to happen with Dak Prescott specifically next year. The McCarthy thing, obviously, is more of a Dallas specific story because it's our head coach. But it's really hard to kind of read the tea leaves on this. I mean, the Cowboys have not exactly lined up their offseason in a way that kind of makes a lot of sense. I mean, they claim that this is kind of an all-in, that's the phrase that Jerry Jones said. I honestly would take that with as much grain of salt as possible because Jerry is famous for having different meanings for phrases than you do. So I think that's probably ignoring, but even like just ignoring Jerry's mouth, which is probably a good thing to do. If you look at their feet, if you look at the way that they're moving, there doesn't seem to be a lot of, coherency between, what their plan is, because if this is truly kind of the make or break season for both McCarthy and Dak Prescott, they seem to be doing it in a season in which they are also trying to clear off a bunch of dead money on their books. They're not trying to spend a bunch of money in free agency. They're not necessarily going out and trying to load up on more talent than they had last season. I think that they've always been reliant on the draft and they've always been reliant on building within, but this year more than others, I would say it has felt like there's been a dry spell in free agency. There hasn't been an effort to, make strides outside of whatever they got in the draft. And that doesn't speak well for this being a make or break season for these two guys in McCarthy and Dak. This is all a long-winded way of saying that the fact that the Cowboys aren't going all in, I think it actually makes it harder to determine whether this means they are basically not giving themselves enough rope to hang themselves, or they have, they know that they're going to re-sign both these guys, and they don't view this as a last season, a last hurrah, and they're clearing off their books for future runs with Dak Prescott and Mike McCarthy. So the long answer is I have come down on both sides of this argument throughout this offseason, and I think it's really, really hard to parse. But if you ask me right now, I would say that I think that I feel pretty confident that one of those two will likely be back next season. I'm not sure that it's both.
Yeah, no, it's going to be interesting to watch. And a lot of people have also talked about, because you mentioned like the whole all in, and then you didn't really do anything outside of spend some draft picks, right? And so people are kind of wondering, there's the old cliche of, everybody's moving forward. So if you're not moving forward, you're standing still, you're actually moving backwards, right? And we know the NFC East is incredibly hard to win back to back. The Eagles were trying to do it last year. The Cowboys spoiled that. So now everybody's wondering, is all this inactivity or perceived inactivity going to bring the Dallas Cowboys back to the mean a little bit, while the New York Giants and Washington Commanders are trying to do things to up their ante? And then, of course, Philadelphia Eagles are trying to bounce back from their late season collapse last year.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think you talk to Cowboys fans, and I think that a lot of them are ready for a fallback to mediocrity or a reset, because I do think that the Cowboys have been at this echelon of teams that have been good but not great, and I think we've been in contention for the NFC East each of the last 6 or 7 years in which we've had a healthy quarterback, let's say that, right? And we've been good enough to be in competition to win the division each of those years. But you get into the playoffs, it seems like it's the same refrain. Once you get into the playoffs, maybe you get a game further than you did the last season. But look, it's a hard thing to not be sure about your coach and quarterback coming back next season after winning 12 games each of the last 3 seasons. Like that really shows you where the Cowboys mindset is that they're pretty sick of just being good enough to make the playoffs and maybe host a home game. Like they're ready to take a step. It's it's been 30 years, so like
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
time for it's definitely time for like something to move here. And I think that the Joneses have done an admirable job of making the Cowboys relevant each season and giving them as many bites at the apple as possible. But at a certain point, there's got to be an opportunity to kind of wipe the slate clean and start over, because
yeah.
what you're doing has only gotten you as far as they've gotten the last 3 and 4 years.
Yeah, I mean, I think all you have to do is visit a Cowboys home game to
Yeah.
realize, if you don't already realize it, that Jerry Jones doesn't do anything to be good. He does it to be great, because that
Mhm.
stadium alone is not even the newest stadium anymore. I've been to stadiums that are newer that are not as nearly as impressive as that stadium still is to this day. So certainly, just getting the playoffs, not enough there in Dallas. And Commanders fans, I got to be honest with you, Landon, Commanders fans are licking their chops, hoping that Week
Oh, I'm
18
sure.
in Dallas, that's a win for the Burgundy and Gold, and maybe it's Dak's last game, maybe it's Mike McCarthy's last game. They would love to be the team to kind of put an L on the end of those two tenures, or even one of them, if that's what happens. But they're also going to be doing it hoping to get Dan Quinn a win in his first game back to Dallas since coming over to be the head coach. What's going on with the Cowboys defense? I know Mike Zimmer's in there as the new D coordinator. How do you think the pieces that he's inheriting from a number 5 overall defense, those are big shoes to fill for any coach, no matter how experienced you are. So how do you think that's going to look this season for the Cowboys
Well,
defense?
yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question to be. I think Zimmer himself even said in an interview after he got hired, he's most of his career he's come into situations with terrible defenses, and that's
Yeah.
why he got hired. Right? Is that he's come in to fix some terrible defense. That is clearly not the case here, right? With what the Cowboys had in Dan Quinn last season. Now, I do think that that Dan, has very specific philosophies in defense, and he did leave the state of the run defense, I would say specifically,
Mm,
in what we would call shambles.
mm,
But I think that's the philosophy that Dan Quinn believes in. So I think that the changes that we're going to see are the changes in the philosophy and the importance of stopping the run to get the opportunity to rush the pass. And so I think the fact that the Cowboys, still have Micah Parsons, still have Trayvon Diggs, still have Deron Bland, still have DeMarcus Lawrence, still have all these guys that are still very good players, I think
yeah.
that's obviously beneficial to them. There will likely be a transition as they kind of get to a new defense, but I do think that when you look at the particulars of the situation, you got Trayvon Diggs, who came from an Alabama defense, which is going to be a very similar
Mm,
coverage system to what Zimmer runs. You've got Deron Bland, who's very good at off man coverage, an off ball coverage, which I think again also will help there. I think DeMarcus Lawrence is a perfect fit for a Mike Zimmer, defensive end type. So and even if Parsons isn't the kind of typical Zimmer defensive end, Zimmer is
mhm.
obviously very well known for sending blitzers from the linebacker level and from sending
Right.
people from all over. So they're going to find a way to get Parsons loose as well. So I think that, what we're hoping for is, maybe you do take a little bit off the gas in the passing game, in the sense that you're not playing, Marquise Bell at linebacker at 218 pounds anymore.
Yeah.
And maybe that, maybe you don't cover running backs and tight ends quite as well as you did last season, but you're also not giving up 5 and 6 yards a carry on the ground to the point where by the fourth quarter, your pass rush doesn't really matter much, because it's been exhausted trying to chase down running backs and being beat up by tackles that are running them over. So I think, personnel wise, you're going to see a lot more fortification in the middle of this defense. They're going to
Mhm.
do a lot more about putting bigger defensive tackles in the middle of that defense. Um, and it's actually one of the interesting things I think about what's going to happen with Quinn at Washington is, now he actually has legitimate defensive tackles that,
Yeah.
he didn't have to, he inherited. So I'm interested to see how that plays out for him in that situation, because I do think it probably will do his defense some good, just like the Cowboys kind of converting to a defense with a little bit more run stopping power up front will probably do them some good.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned that star position, man. I'll tell you, Jeremy Chin is not a small dude by any means, but you put him in the box next to like some linebackers and stuff, and you're like, oh, he's not as big as I thought he was, and you definitely do sacrifice a little bit of
You know,
size
there's some
to
things he
get
will
that
do
athleticism.
incredibly well, and some things that that is going to be tough for him to take on a guard as he's getting up on the second
Yeah.
level and inside zone. So yeah, you give and take.
It'll be interesting. It'll be interesting. Last question for you, Landon. It's way too early, so hopefully nobody here, nobody there is going to hold you to it. But I do want to get every NFC East host's opinion. How do you stack the NFC East at this point in time? We're mid to late June, ladies and gentlemen. So please remember that in the context. But how do you stack up the NFC East right now?
I'm probably, it's tough to it's always tough to compare the Cowboys and the Eagles,
Yeah.
so I'm still probably putting them at the top. I would just probably my own bias. I'll put the Cowboys above the Eagles just because I still have more faith in Dak Prescott than I do Jalen Hurts.
Mhm.
And it's, having I have some familiarity with Kellen Moore as well, and I'm not exactly sure how all that's going to fit up there.
Yeah.
But we'll see. I think look, I mean, this is a lot of faith in my own quarterback, but I think the Cowboys still have Dak Prescott. They still have CeeDee Lamb. They still got Micah Parsons. They still got Trayvon Diggs and a lot of really great players. So there is definitely some jumbling going on right now. And I think that there's definitely going to be a lot of growing pains early in the season for the Cowboys. But I still think that they have an opportunity. You know what? Here's what I'll do. I'm going to pick Philly to win the East because
Yeah.
like you said, no team has won the NFC East back to back in I think 25 plus years at this point.
Yeah.
So I'll pick Philly to win just because it's procedural. I'll pick the Dallas next, and I do think that Washington is more so than New York, in my opinion, is coming up the rear, right? Like really starting to make ground on the other two teams.
Mhm.
Obviously, like we talked about blowing a team up and the kind of the feel goodness of a purge, of those situations and
Right.
kind of I mean, nobody knows that better than Washington this last offseason. The vibes around there must be
Yeah.
immaculate. And I do think that they've made a lot of really positive moves around the organization, which I think, getting positive momentum, especially in an organization that, has had some real problems, I think is a good thing. And I think it's going to turn things around for them. And for the Giants, they got to get rid of Daniel Jones, and they got to they got to figure out what they're doing with their quarterback situation. And until they do, I just don't know that they've built enough of a talented roster around them. Dexter Lawrence can only do so much, and so
Right. Right.
I think I would probably stack it as Philly, Dallas, Washington, and New York coming up behind.